Hey everybody. In this super short video, I'm going to explain to you how Darwin and Wallace's idea about evolution by natural selection differs from Lamarck's idea. And first of all, I mean, why care, right? Like, why care? So there's a historical reason to care because we like to attribute ideas to the first people who had them. And historians have spent a lot of time talking about how Darwin and Wallace were really the first people to think about natural selection and how they beat Lamarck to the punch. Not by much, though, by a teeny tiny bit. And then we're going to talk about how Lamarck managed to be right. In fact, the entire field of epigenetics kind of proves that Lamarck is right. And some scholars have argued, some evolutionary biologists have argued that, in fact, we've spent so much time thinking about evolution from a Mendelian perspective that we've missed a whole swath of ways that evolution can work. And we've maybe focused on the wrong thing. So it's important to pay attention to this. The other thing that is important about this conversation is that Lamarck gets lambasted by history. And it is my belief that one of the reasons that he gets lambasted isn't so much that he was slightly wrong about natural selection. It has to do with the fact that he was part of Napoleon's group, and that's not particularly a fault of his own. That is a fault of the time that he was in. I mean, if Napoleon says, "Hey, you got to come do this for me," who are you to say no? Like, wouldn't be me. Not that I'm a Napoleon fan. Don't get me wrong there. I'm just saying that when an important political leader appoints you to something, it's not surprising that you would say yes. It's, Napoleon wasn't always, I don't want to get into history. All right, so let's talk about how Lamarck and Darwin differed. Okay, now, even as I said that, and even if you look at the slide, I've written Darwinian instead of Wallace and Darwin. And even that, hopefully you got to some of this when you were making the memes about Wallace and Darwin. You saw that, why didn't Wallace get the same credit that Darwin got? And part of the reason is because it's a historical reason. Darwin was part of the upper class in England at the time. And in fact, even though Darwin and Wallace together gave that talk at the Linnean Society, it was Darwin who paid the social cost. And one of the reasons, so I didn't put this in the last video, but there's a long period of time between the time that Darwin finished his book and Wallace finished his book. And Darwin probably wouldn't have published if Wallace hadn't come knocking on his door. And Wallace completely sucked up to Darwin for this because Wallace had his book finished and he was ready to publish it. And his friend said, "Hey, Chuck's got his book done and it's the same thing." And, in a different day and different age, Wallace would have said, "Screw this horseshit, I'm publishing my book." But because Wallace was part of the lower class and Darwin was part of the upper class, he went up to Darwin and said, "Hey, man, looks like we're doing the same thing." And so after the Linnean Society, which they both presented together, Darwin was the one who had all the political cartoons. And in fact, you can Google image Darwin political cartoons. And, they've got pictures of him like up in a tree with his big beard and people climbing up the tree and regardless. But the truth is that Darwin would not have published if Wallace hadn't been putting his boot on his ass saying, "Publish with me or publish never, or I'll beat you to it." And Wallace and Darwin were only slightly different than Lamarck. So let's explore some of this. Gotta press the right buttons. Okay, so Lamarck assumed that once you had a trait, you could pass it down to your children. And I don't mean humans, I mean peacocks and giraffes. What about Wallace and Darwin? Did they think that? They sure did. All three of these men understood that once you had a trait, you could pass it down to your children. Yeah, it's not good animation. I apologize. So Lamarck and Darwin and Wallace only differ in their idea about where traits came from originally. So you're a parent and you got a trait, you're going to pass it on, but where did the parent get the trait? That's where Lamarck fell down a little bit. It's just a subtle wrongness. So Lamarck thought that traits came from immediate need. And the reason that he thought that was because traits are plastic. We don't think about traits as being plastic. We think about, even if we think about something like IQ, we think about natural ability that you're born with, right? Because, it just seems like some people are smarter than other people. But even how smart you are is plastic, because studying for the GREs or the SATs makes you get higher scores. How well you were fed in first grade and pre-K determines how well you test in first grade, which influences the placement you get. And you can make up for that in seventh grade by studying the hell out of something. So even traits like intelligence can be plastic. But skin color is plastic. Are you out in the sun? Is it January or June? Your skin color, I don't care what color you are, your skin color is different in January and June if you live in the United States. How muscly you are, well, the color of your hair, all of these things are really plastic. And Lamarck mistook that plasticity for a trait coming from immediate need. And you can kind of see his point, right? Like, if you are somebody who needs a lot of muscles because your job requires that, like you're a stevedore, that's somebody who moves um, um, packages and great big boxes off of ships. You're a stevedore, you need muscles, but the more you move shit, the bigger your muscles get. And so immediate need leads to more muscle leads to, you can see that. So then Lamarck then mistook this idea that a muscly person can pass down their muscles to their kids. And some things are tricky. For instance, if you grow up in a house where your parents are great violinists, is it going to be surprising that you're a great violinist? No. It could look like it has a genetic component, but it's just exposure. Plus, probably some things like ability to focus. There are a couple of genes that promote an ability to focus, right? And if you inherit those from your parents and you decide to focus on a violin, you could have focused on an oboe or, I don't know, genetics. And but that ability to focus is associated with being really good at one thing. You can see how having a trait looks like you could pass it down. Small thing. Okay, so Lamarck thought that you got a trait from need, and that once you had that trait, you could pass it down. You needed to be a good violinist, you became a good violinist, your kids would be a good violinist. Wallace and Darwin thought that understood this a little bit better. Like, where did the parents get it? They get it from their parents. And you can see this is a chicken and egg problem, right? Like, if you had posed this to Lamarck, Lamarck would have said something like, well, where did their parents get it? Well, where did their parents get it? And then you have to launch into this description of bell curves and shifting. And you guys have no idea what I'm talking about, but we'll get to that in the next lecture. But so close. So close. So Lamarck and Wallace and Darwin, just subtly different, and it has to do with where your parents get a trait. Okay, so this is I'm sure you guys have seen this graph before, this flow chart before. This flow chart was in my biology book when I was in high school, so this is not new, but it's an important chart, and it pays to kind of think about this for a minute. Okay, let's see if I can do this. I hope I'm not going to annotate the rest of my slides, but there are only 5 slides, so if I do, it's not that bad. So let's look at this basic idea of Lamarck. Okay, so you have this, let's use giraffes as an example, because Lamarck is famous for screwing up um, giraffe necks and why giraffes have long necks. And in fact, when I was a graduate school, there's nothing as, God, I don't know, as arrogant as a graduate student, right? So, because you're so competitive, so smart. And we had these t-shirts that had a big giraffe on them with a big circle with a red, like a no giraffe. And then the word said Lamarck was a dumbass. Okay, you know who's a dumbass? Everybody who wore that t-shirt, because Lamarck was not a dumbass. Okay, so let's look at this. Internal urge. Okay, so giraffes have this internal urge to eat, and it's associated with an environmental change. All of the acceptable food is gone at the lower level. It's only up at the high. So the giraffes are sitting there stretching their neck, stretching their neck. And so they have this new need, and this new need is to eat the leaves on the top of the trees. Okay, so let's go this way. We'll go this way. We'll go the opposite way for the cavefish. So we're going to go here, and we're going to talk. They're going to use an organ. What are they going to use? Their neck. They're going to stretch their neck, stretch their neck, stretch their neck. Their structures are going to change. They're going to develop better. They're going to get longer necks. The parents are going to have acquired a character, which is a long neck. The giraffes of the future are going to have longer necks than the giraffes of the past. This is going to mean that these giraffes are eventually going to lead to a new species. So Lamarck would have looked at something like an okapi, which is a giraffe-like animal, but it's got a longer neck than a horse, but a shorter neck than a giraffe, and it's got some giraffe-like patterns. And he's like, see, there's the intermediate stuff. Not a stupid idea, just a wrong idea. Okay, so over here, so internal urge to be able to sense your environment, environmental change. I'm talking about cavefish now. Environmental changes. Okay, these fish are living in the dark 24/7 all the time. New needs, they need to navigate their dark caves and find food in the dark. They don't need eyeballs anymore. So we're talking about the disuse of organs, don't need their eyeballs anymore. So they invest metabolic energy in growth, or I don't know, electric, like sharks, where they send out and platypuses that send out the electrical signal and then bounce it back. The structures disappear. Bye-bye eyeballs. And inheritance of acquired character. Eyelessness is the acquired character. Origin of a new species. Okay, that's how Lamarck would have interpreted this. Let's see what would have happened. Oh, I hope this red pen doesn't follow me to the next slide. Let's find out. Okay, so, before I go to the next slide, I would like to point out that Lamarck's biggest error was that he saw these changes happening within one lifetime, right? The grown-up giraffes and the grown-up fish, it's all in one lifetime. And so you can get speciation happening super quickly, which generally doesn't happen. Speciation, you can get adaptations pretty quickly, but you don't get speciation happening very quickly. Okay. Oh, it didn't follow me. Yay. Okay, so this flow chart describes Darwinism, and also there is no Wallaceism, but Darwin and Wallaceism. Okay, so we're going to start with overproduction, right? And we're getting this from Malthus, who said that populations are going to outrun their food supplies. That's going to lead to competition or a struggle for existence. There's going to be variation in any population. So, for example, if we were all sitting in a classroom and I let out 100 rats into the classroom, don't worry, they'd be magic rats, they wouldn't bite you. And if they climbed up your legs, they would only climb up the legs of people who they thought wanted to have rats on their legs. There are such people. So we've got 100 rats in the room. So there's going to be variation in how fast they are. There's going to be variation in how big they are. There's going to be variation in their personality types. Are they aggressive? Are they fearful? There's going to be variation in their intelligence. So there's going to be a suite of variations in there. So when I first let the rats loose in the classroom, they're not hungry, they're just fine. But let's say that I start limiting the food and I only put food, a chunk of cheese into this classroom once every Sunday morning. And it's not quite enough cheese to feed all the rats. So some rats are going to have unfavorable variations, and some rats are going to have favorable variations. So a favorable variation might be aggressive rats. And those are the rats who get to the cheese and beat the crap out of all the other rats. And so they get the most cheese. Another favorable variation might be rats who are smart enough to build alliances. And so they say to the other rats, hey, let's go get to the cheese first. And you hold them at bay and I'll get it and we'll share it. Could happen. Rats are pretty smart. That would be a favorable variation. Okay, so that means that, let's keep an easier one though. Let's say that the rats who are the fastest get to the cheese. And so those are the rats that win. So the fastest rats are the ones who get the most cheese. And let's say that there's some cheese left over. So like the fastest rats are going to get there first. They're going to have the most babies. Those babies are going to be the most successful because they're going to be a little bit faster than the previous generation. And you're going to have this gradual, over time, accumulation of favorable variation. So for instance, before we started this experiment, let's say that we put rats on treadmills, and let's say we gave them just a tiny little shock, and we tracked how fast they could run if they were super motivated, and it would be X miles per hour. Okay. And then we let this experiment go on, where we limited food a little bit and we rewarded the fast rats by feeding them, and the slow rats didn't get enough food, and so they would be the fast rats would out reproduce the slow rats. That would mean that if we took our original population and we put them all on treadmills and zapped them a little bit and measured how fast they could run, we would get a bell curve of speeds, right? So we would have fast rats over here, slow rats over here, and it would make a curve like here. And there would be a median, or mean, some measure of center right here. So let's say that on the first day of our test, when we let the 100 first rats in there, let's say that the average speed was, I don't know how fast a rat can run, God forbid, not 30 miles an hour, but let's say 2 miles an hour. Average speed when we start is 2 miles an hour. And we keep limiting food and we keep rewarding the fast rats and we keep slightly calling out the slow rats. And then we measure speed 5 generations later. So the speed is going to move. I don't know if you can see, if I have to flip this, a little bit to the right. And so they're going to, instead of being 2 miles an hour, let's say they're 3 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour. So the average speed is going to get pushed faster because we're selecting for fast rats and we're selecting against slow rats. Okay, so that is how Darwinism and Wallaceism generally works. So it accumulates right here with this origin of a new species. And I just want to point out that, like, there's a big jump between this gradual accumulation and an origin of a new species, because to get speciation to really occur, you need to sort of have two things happen. You need to have this gradual change that I was talking about, but then you also need to have some sort of genetic isolation. You need to stop these guys who are a little bit faster from breeding with these guys who are a little bit slower. So a river comes up, or these guys get airlifted to Thailand, some crazy shit. The aliens decide to take the fast ones to Mars. I don't know, but you need some sort of genetic isolation. Maybe the fast rats get on a ship, right? And they really do go someplace else, because God knows rats, I don't know if you guys watch The Expanse, but there are rats in The Expanse. Like, rats go everywhere that people go. But for the step between the gradual accumulation and the origin of a new species requires a second step that is implied in here, but not explicit. And that is you need some genetic isolation in order to get a new species. You can get a modified species this way, but to get a whole new species, you need one more thing. All right. Okay. And remember the previous slide, I told you that where Lamarck really goofed up was he missed the time element. He thought this was happening in one generation. Wallace and Darwin both understood that you needed many generations. So, how many generations, you ask? I heard you. So, it depends on how strong the selection pressure is. So, insects can develop resistance to particular pesticides within 8 generations. So, you can get evolution happening, measurable evolution happening in 8 generations. It looks like we can cause domestication, at least 3/4 of a way of domestication in about 8 generations. And that's with pretty severe culling. But if your selection pressure is a little bit tamped back a little bit, it can take longer. So there's not a simple answer here, but in the most extreme cases, it looks like you can get adaptations and even something approaching speciation in as few as 8 generations. Not going to be any faster than that, usually going to be slower than that. And if you guys were listening to this lecture in ecology and evolution at Stony Brook University, very few people would say 8 generations, that's crazy. And then you can say, but Dr. Pochron said, if you apply pesticides to a field full of insects, and they'll have to go, oh yeah, that's true. Most people don't think about evolution in terms of real world. They think about how it happens naturally without human interference. But even in the natural world without human interference, sometimes you get really severe selection pressure. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so maybe some of you have seen this graphic before. This is, it's funny because this graphic was in the same high school textbook I had when I was 14. And every time I'm in a class, I ask students if they've seen this before, and everybody says, yeah, we've seen this before. I'm just going to point out, when I was a kid, I thought this was a super confusing graphic. And it's because it seems like that this is time step 1, time step 2, time step 3, and that it's the same for Lamarck and Darwin, which is a lie. That is not what's going on here. Lamarck is all just time step 1. This is all happening in one generation. Darwin is time step 1, time step 2, time step 3. So in Lamarck's, when Lamarck tried to explain giraffe necks, this is what he said. You've heard this story, but this is a graphic version of it. Parents came, they needed to eat high, stretch their necks, stretch their necks. And then their necks got longer, and then they were super long. Okay, what did Darwin say? Well, Darwin said, okay, and Wallace, okay, so there's variation in giraffe necks, and only the ones with the tallest necks could eat the leaves. Rip this one. This is a dead giraffe right here. So natural selection culls out the guys with the short necks in the 2nd generation, and by the 3rd generation, or maybe this is one generation right here, and then this is the second one. But this is selection against the guys with the short necks, and this is at least, at least 2, because look how short their necks here, and how long they are here. So multiple generations have occurred between those necks and those necks. Okay, whereas this is all happening in one generation. Okay, I think that might be it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and the next lecture is about natural selection and how that works. See you guys later.